Okay, Talia, it's so nice to see you again. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Great. So this is going to be part two. What are we going to talk about today?
Right. So I guess some of our talks will be related to the history of Hebrew and Israel. They kind of go hand in hand, you know. So, so the Hebrew language, as everybody knows, is a Semitic language from the Middle East. And today we're going to do a very brief overview of the Hebrew alphabet's history.
Okay.
So the cool thing about it is that it's not only the history of the Hebrew alphabet, it's the history of all of the alphabets in the world. So,
Wow. Okay, I didn't know that. Well, just before you start, just in case people didn't watch our first installment, our first
yeah.
episode together, if you could just briefly introduce yourself and sort of your background, and then I can't wait to do this review. You know, I went to Hebrew school, so we'll see how much I
Okay.
remember.
Yeah, I think this will be interesting for you. So
Okay.
it's not going to be a test, so don't worry.
Oh, good, good. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm Italian. I was born in Israel. I was raised in Israel and in America. I teach Hebrew at LanguageBird, and I have a background in archaeology and Near Eastern studies. So in my university studies, I learned ancient languages. I learned a lot about the history of not only Israel, but the surrounding area, the whole Near East. Because as you know, Israel is not an isolate. It traded with its neighboring countries or civilizations. It was influenced by the two superpowers of the ancient world, which were Egypt and Mesopotamia. So that's going to be the background to our talk today. I myself am also a language learner. I like to study lots of different languages. Right now I'm focusing on Latin. And yes, maybe in a few years I'll be good at it.
Good.
So I guess we can start, and I will share my screen now. Let's
Okay.
see. All right. I'll move us. There you go. All right. So I said we were going to talk about the alphabet. So before we even talk about it, let's talk about the name. So where does the name come from? Alphabet, right? So the word is a Greek word that is borrowed into most European languages, and it's made up of the first two letters of the alphabet, the Greek alphabet, which are alpha and beta. You can see them here. They kind of look like the English A and B, kind of. When you look at the A, the alpha kind of looks like a cursive lowercase a, and the beta kind of looks like an uppercase B.
Mhm.
So the Hebrew word for alphabet is aleph bet. So where do you think that comes from?
Wow. Let me think. Derived from, right? Very similar.
Yeah. So it's also it comes from the first two letters of the Hebrew alphabet, aleph and bet. Together they make aleph bet. Now, when you look at it, you look at the Greek word and the Hebrew word, and you're probably asking yourself, how come they're so similar? They're practically the same word, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So that is because they have a common origin. So what do you think came first, the Hebrew or the Greek?
What do I think first?
Yeah, what came first, the Hebrew or the Greek alphabet?
I'm gonna guess because I don't know the Greek alphabet.
So no, right answer.
No.
So Hebrew came first, and the Greek alphabet is based on the same ancient Hebrew alphabet
Hmm.
that Hebrew is derived from. So that's the cool part about it. Now, not to say that the Greeks didn't write before, they wrote, but they had a really weird writing system that hasn't been completely deciphered to this day. It's called linear A or linear B. Nobody wants to read that. It's horrible. So they were very happy to adopt the alphabetic system once they did. And through the Greeks, other parts of Europe adopted it, like the Romans and the Germanic tribes at a later point in time. So that is just a little intro. Now we're going to get a little into the history of it. We're going to take it back a few thousand years.
Okay.
And we're going to talk about the origin of writing systems. So there are arguably three independent centers of writing evolution. One of them is China. Now, we don't really know if the Chinese one was earlier than the Middle Eastern one. Obviously, people from the Middle East say they were first, and the Chinese say they were first. So it's kind of hard to prove at this time. But the big writing systems from the Middle East come from Egypt and Mesopotamia. So this is kind of like the world that we're going to talk about today. Just this part of the world. This is the Mediterranean, and this is modern day Israel right over here, where an ancient form of Hebrew was spoken. We're going to refer to this country as Canaan, like the biblical Canaan.
Okay.
And this is around, we're talking about like the Bronze Age. So this is around anywhere between 4000 BC to the years we're going to talk about are like around 1000 BC. So it's quite a long time. So around 3200 BC, two writing systems emerged in the Near East. One was in Egypt, so the one that everybody likes, the hieroglyphs. Everybody thinks it looks cool, very, very popular. And the other one is cuneiform, and that emerged in Mesopotamia. Not as popular, probably not as graphically pleasing to many people. And also because I think in general, Mesopotamia is not as popular as ancient Egypt nowadays. So Israel or Canaan was actually a little more influenced by Mesopotamia at that time. So we will find cuneiform inscriptions or texts sporadically throughout Israel at this time. Less Egyptian texts. If we found any Egyptian texts, they were related to like the Egyptian military that was actually there. So not so much a local. All right, so these are the two superpowers. Think about like Russia and America of the ancient world, except they were much closer to each other. But in order to get from one to the other, look where they need to cross. They need to go through Israel, right?
Yeah. So
it's kind of like in between these two. All right. So these are the two examples of the two ancient writing systems. So as we mentioned, the hieroglyphs, which are super beautiful and everybody loves, they're always accompanied by art. They look very artistic, right?
Sure.
And then compared to the Sumerian writing, which comes from Mesopotamia, a little more schematic, a little less pleasing to the eye. What do you think?
Gosh, well, I like both. I think both are really cool, but definitely the hieroglyphs look, more pictorial, more of a story without translating or looking at similar symbols and the like. So maybe you could figure out a little bit more or more easily from the hieroglyphs because of the artistic aspects to it.
Right. That's actually a good point. And you said the word pictorial, which is kind of key here, because these writing systems are not so much like what we're used to today. For example, today when you write the word apple, A-P-P-L-E, you're actually writing out each little sound in the word, and the letters stand for sounds, for basic sounds rather than entire ideas or words, correct?
Right.
So these systems originally were based on ideas. So for example, I'm not so good, I don't know Egyptian very well. I mean, I didn't study Egyptian. So like one symbol would stand for an idea or an entire word. It could be abstract, it could be not so abstract. And the original Sumerian writing did the same, maybe not in such a nice, such an aesthetically pleasing way, but they did. Now, the main difference is the writing medium. So I think a lot of people are probably familiar with what Egyptians used to write on. What our ancient paper was based on, papyrus, right?
Right.
So they used ink, so they could use like a stylus and ink and write, so they could have all of these squiggly lines, curvy lines. The Sumerians didn't have any papyrus. They lived in a harsher environment, and the only natural resource they had pretty much was dirt.
Okay.
So they made clay tablets. What is that?
Dirt and sand, right?
Yeah. So they used clay tablets to write on.
Mm-hmm.
So their stylus was also made of some kind of like cane, and they would stab it. They would kind of stab and poke at the clay tablet to create these signs. And that's why they're a little more angular and not as squiggly as the Egyptian characters.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also where the name comes from. The word cunia in Latin means like a wedge.
Mm.
So they would wedge their writing into the clay instead of painting it on like the Egyptians did. Now, of course, some of them also wrote on stone later, but they were very highly skilled artisans, and they were very good at it.
So a question about this,
Sure.
The design to me, or the words to me, seem to pop up rather than like if you were taking a tool and carving into it, right? At least from this picture, it looks like it's raised rather than something.
This one?
Yeah.
It might look like it, but actually it's imprinted onto the clay.
It's imprinted. Okay, so it's not like, it's not raised up. Okay.
No, now it could be sometimes, but usually it was imprinted.
Okay.
It, like later forms, maybe in like monumental writing or something like that on stone, but usually it would be carved into the stone.
Okay.
So what does this have to do with our alphabet? Because we talked about the pictorial signs. They're also called pictograms. That's the other word that we would use for this. And what writing system kind of works similarly this day, just from general knowledge that you can think of? Like, think about the Far East. The language that everybody says is really hard to learn because there are thousands and thousands of characters.
Which one is more similar?
Yeah, like a modern day language that the people speak today.
Oh, like Chinese? Or?
Exactly. So Chinese, everybody always says that Mandarin is so hard to master because you have to learn all these different characters. And even most Chinese people don't know most of them. So it's not a very, let's say, accessible writing system. You need
user friendly.
Yeah, exactly. You need to be like a specialized scribe that knows how to use all of these things. So our alphabet kind of is tied into this because it used some of the ideas of these writing systems, but it revolutionized them. So that's what we're going to talk about next. Now, which one came first? Most people agree that cuneiform came first. Look, about 100 years earlier, not that it matters. And it underwent many evolutions. You'll see a later form of it soon. And hieroglyphs developed maybe a little bit later, but pretty much at the same time. And originally, they were very pictographic. So again, like each symbol stands for an idea or an abstract idea or not so abstract. And then, so later, before the original alphabet, simpler people started getting sick and tired of learning all of these characters. And they said, why not take the characters that we kind of know already and just come up with a phonetic value for them? Mm-hmm. So instead of having a separate character for each word or each idea, they started coming up with characters derived from the pictograms that stood for a specific syllable. It wasn't even just a letter like we write today, like P just stands for P or L just stands for L. They were actual syllables. So for example, this one is Ka, and this one is Ke, and this one is Ku. Or this one is Pa, this one is Pu. So this is a slight development from the pictograms. Mm-hmm. And so this became the Akkadian writing system, mm-hmm. which is another Mesopotamian language. And actually this was the language that was probably written the most and for the longest time in the history of the world. Wow. So this language was written for thousands of years, and it was like the lingua franca of the Near East for a couple of millennia.
Wow.
Yeah.
It seems so complicated to remember that graph, right? To remember.
It is. It takes time.
Yes.
It takes time. So so it's funny because most of the writers of that time were scribes that were taken as small children and were taught and they didn't even know what they were writing. Mostly they would just copy texts. They might have not even understood what they were writing. So they just copied. So when you get into research, you can, there are many, many errors that you can see. So don't worry, everybody wrote with mistakes back then. It is very hard to remember, I agree. And especially when you try to write it on paper, it's even harder because it's not made for paper. Remember, it's made to be wedged into clay.
Yeah, okay.
So you see that, so the Sumerian or Mesopotamian system also evolved from pictures. Look, for example, fish. Originally, they kind of like drew out a fish, almost drew it out schematically. Then it became a little bit more abstract. And in the end, they're like, we can't do this anymore. We need to find a faster way of representing the fish. So they just started wedging, you know, they kind of like came up with this symbol. But look at them compared to Egypt. Look at their fish. Was drawn out beautifully, wasn't it?
Right. Very representational.
Right, exactly. And so you can see the evolution. Like over the years, they kind of like they strayed away from you know, representing each word beautifully, or more I guess you would call like literally, like a literal representation of the word, and it became just more like a symbolic character. Look at the axe, for example, or arrow, bottle, things like that. So again, we're getting to the Hebrew alphabet because I just wanted to show you that they started writing things more phonetically. Okay, so then the first alphabetic inscription was actually based on Egyptian hieroglyphs, and we're going to get to it in a second. So who were these people who wrote the first alphabetic inscription? So they were Canaanites. Remember, the land between Egypt and Mesopotamia, modern day Israel, and maybe even Lebanon, was called Canaan at the time. This was the Bronze Age. So the Egyptians were this big superpower here. Look at their wonderful delta and the Nile River Valley. They had agriculture and pyramids, and they were highly sophisticated. And they also liked to take advantage of all the natural resources that they had. Now, one really cool natural resource that they had was turquoise. And where were the mines? In the middle of one of the hottest deserts in the world, right here in the Sinai Peninsula. And here's a picture of the ancient settlement where the mine was. Now look at it. Does it look like a place you want to spend time in?
Not really.
Not really. And especially not mining. What do you think?
They what? What was the question?
Especially not while mining.
Not while mining, no.
Yes, no. Maybe for like an afternoon if you have enough water and shade.
Right, as opposed to being in the lush Egypt, right?
Exactly. So how did the Egyptians solve this? They said, well, we don't really want to go live in the Sinai. It's a bit too hot for us. It's a little too far from home. We don't have any beer. It's going to be boring. So Egyptians often took Canaanites as slaves. They really like to have Semitic slaves. They would call them Asiatic slaves.
Okay.
And you can see a depiction here. So they're often depicted like these people here with beards and like a nice little curly afro, as opposed to the Egyptians, which were much more handsome and tan and had beautiful long hair. So they would take a lot of these Canaanites as slaves and put them to work at the turquoise mines in the Sinai. So these slaves were pretty clever. They weren't, they learned some form of Egyptian hieroglyphs. They weren't professional scribes, but they could write. Now they had to write because they had to keep work diaries, and they had to kind of like, they were put in charge of administration. So they needed to know some writing, but they didn't speak the same language as the Egyptians. They spoke Hebrew, like a very ancient form of Hebrew, because they come from here. So an ancient form of Phoenician or Canaanite. However, they learned the Egyptian writing system, but they weren't so sophisticated. So what they did is they took the Egyptian hieroglyphs. They chose maybe a set of 20-something Egyptian hieroglyphs, and they kind of came up with the letters that pertain to them. So for example, this one kind of looks like a human head.
Yeah.
Kind of looks like it. Now, I don't know what it stands for in Egyptian. I'm sure it's a person or something like that, but I don't know how to say it.
Okay.
So they took that, and in Hebrew, the word for head is rosh. In modern Hebrew, and in ancient Hebrew, it was resh. Resh meant head. So they just took this letter and they made it into like an R. They said, well, resh starts with a r sound, so this character is just going to stand for r.
Oh, okay.
So this was the revolution. How is this different from the pictograms? Each character represents a phoneme, a basic sound. And so this is a kind of like a graffiti inscription from the mines, from the turquoise mines. Now, don't ask me what it says. I could figure it out, but it will take me some time. So that was
here.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. It's like, where is our beer? Everybody likes to drink beer back then. That's what they lived on pretty much. So this was the big revolution, and this took place at around, well, we're not sure, but around 1800 BC. So way before Lan or even Greek inscriptions. And this was the big revolution, because for the first time in the history of the world that we know of, that's been recorded, people started writing with characters that stand for a sound rather than an idea.
Wow, okay.
So this was also better than, remember, the Akkadians wrote in syllables. That's also not very practical, is it?
Right.
It's a little better, but not that great. So now this, you could take this alphabet and pretty much manipulate it and use it with every other language in the world, because if it stands for basic sounds, then all you need to do is just kind of like adapt it to whichever language.
Right.
So here you have a schematic Proto-Canaanite Aleph. Now remember the first two letters of the alphabet, Aleph and Bet, or Alpha and Beta in Greek. Look at them. They look almost the same as an alpha today.
Yeah.
Now, if you take this and you kind of turn it maybe 90 degrees, it looks like an A, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then this kind of looks like an upside down B.
If you turn it really like the same way.
Exactly. So, and also nowadays we write Hebrew from right to left, but that wasn't always the case. You could write Hebrew from left to right, from right to left. Back in the day, they didn't care which direction you wrote in.
So do you know at what point they decided that instead we're going to write from left to right, as opposed to other languages that write the opposite way?
I'm not sure exactly, but I will guess that it's around when they started writing in Aramaic, because Aramaic also played a major role in the evolution of the Hebrew alphabet. So at first it was Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, and then Aramaic kind of took the place of Hebrew as the vernacular, and then Hebrew made a comeback later on. So this is a modern Hebrew Aleph and modern Hebrew Bet, which don't really look like it, but I will show you some of the evolution in a minute. Now, but if I don't know if you remember the cursive Aleph, it looks much more similar. Okay, so we'll see that in a minute. So Proto-Canaanite became the first alphabet ever to be used. As you see here, this is the entire original alphabet. It kind of looks like the hieroglyphs, doesn't it?
Yeah, a little bit more.
Right? For example, what is this? It's a fish.
Fish, right?
And that just became the dalet, or delta in Greek, and it only stands for D. Now, if you see this symbol, it doesn't mean fish, it just means D. It's just a sound. Can you recognize this animal?
Like an antelope?
Well, same family. It's an ox.
Oh, an ox. Okay.
Yeah.
I was trying to think of something that start with an A.
Yeah.
Or
so we'll get to that in a moment. So back to the Proto-Canaanite alphabet. I told you that this is not only the history of the Hebrew alphabet, it's the history of all of the alphabets in the world. Now, how is that even possible? How can they all come from the same one? Well, because we had the Phoenicians and they did us all a favor. So I'm sure you've heard of the Phoenician alphabet, Phoenician writing, Phoenician traders. So Phoenicians were just a group of Canaanite people. It's just a name of a certain group. And they lived in the area of like modern day Lebanon and also the very north of Israel. They lived on the Mediterranean coast right here. So they were Canaanites like all the rest. So they were writing in this Proto-Canaanite alphabet. They were writing away in their ancient Hebrew. And one day they decided they're going to go all around the Mediterranean and take their writing with them. And that's how we got to Greece.
And is that where we get the word or the origins of the word phonetic? Like if you do the phonetic spelling of something, or no?
I think that comes from the Greek word for sound, like phonos.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's where it comes from, phonetic. But no, it's interesting. I might look into it because it does sound similar. So these Phoenicians were known as sea traders, and they went all around the Mediterranean, as I mentioned. And eventually they became really good friends with the Greek. So the Greek were like, wow, look at this writing system. We don't have to write in that terrible linear B anymore, with the writing system that nobody understands, which was also kind of pictographic. Like we were talking, very impractical, very just not accessible, or as you said, user friendly. So they said, wow, what a great idea. Let's start using this Phoenician alphabet, but with our own language. So even though the languages are not related, the alphabet still kind of worked. So after the Greek adopted the alphabet, so did the Romans and the rest of Europe. So here you see different versions of the Phoenician Aleph, or A, or Alpha. So they look a bit different today, but you can see all of these alphabets are based on the same one. So the Latin, which is what we use, right, in English.
Right.
Sanskrit, which you wouldn't think that such an ancient language is written with an alphabet that came from the Near East, would you? I was surprised to find that out.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, now Arabic kind of simplified the Aleph. They said, well, we're just going to make a line out of it.
Just forget the other part.
Right. And then the Greek and Cyrillic are very, very close to the Phoenician alphabet because they were kind of the first ones. Well, Greek was, Cyrillic is a later kind of play on the Greek alphabet. And the Hebrew, and then even the runes, like the letters that the Vikings used, they weren't original. They're also based on the same alphabet.
And I wonder how much they tried to communicate together, right? So as it started to diverge and look differently, I'm just thinking about as it evolved, how it became probably increasingly more difficult for them to figure out what others were saying. And if that was sort of intentional or just a natural evolution.
So I don't think that they understood what they were saying anyway, because even though the writing system stems from the same origin, the languages are still different. So they might use the same, like for example,
the same letter.
They use the same letter, but the languages might not be related. So like the spoken languages were still very different. But in a way, this writing system was such a hit because each letter represents a phoneme or a sound, that it just took off, and all the languages, or most of them, adopted them because it was just that much better to use. Because you only need to learn a few, like 20-something characters, and you can write every word in your language instead of memorizing thousands and thousands of characters.
Sure.
Yeah. So again, people probably did not understand each other though.
Okay.
Yeah, but at least it makes it a little bit easier. If you're using the same alphabet, at least you can kind of like learn the language a little bit. You can kind of like skip a few phases, right?
Right.
So it does make it a little easier. So here we can finally look at the evolution of the Aleph, of the first letter of the alphabet. You see that in Hebrew it's called Aleph, and in Phoenician it was called Alap. So this is how it was written, kind of like an alpha, kind of like an A, kind of like an aleph in cursive as well. And how did we get to the modern aleph? Through Aramaic. They kind of like, I don't know, they kind of turned it on its side and came up with different graphic designs over the years until we reached this aleph that we know today.
Okay.
Yeah, so this took a while. This took at least 1,000 years. Wow. And of course, these are like the big jumps. So we're not seeing all of the in-betweens between this and this. Now, the cool thing about the word aleph, about the letter aleph, is that it comes from the Egyptian hieroglyph for ox, because the word for ox in ancient Hebrew is aluf. Aluf is an ox, so aluf kind of sounds like aleph, doesn't it?
Yeah, very much.
Right. I mean, because remember with Hebrew, we used to never write vowels at all.
Right.
So if you take away the vav, this is actually an aleph. That's what it said. So at first they were very, at first they did, like draw the entire ox. It even has like a little eye and it has an ear. It was more close to the original. And then, so these were the Egyptians. They were very artistic. And then remember the Semitic slaves in the mines? They were like, no, we're just going to do this. That's enough.
Yeah.
That's enough.
Yeah.
And then the Canaanites were like, well, this is enough for us too. We're just going to do that.
Wow. Okay.
It evolved into the aleph that we know today.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's
this is the cursive. This is modern Hebrew cursive aleph. Looks more like the original than the print.
That's for sure.
Yeah. So that is pretty much the evolution of how the Hebrew alphabet came to be. And you can see it in another letter. I just like this one because it's a snake. I think it's cute. So this is the Egyptian hieroglyph. It's a snake.
Okay.
And Nun in Aramaic means snake. And Nun is the name of the letter.
Oh.
And what if you turn this? If it mirror image, it's an N, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So that's pretty much it. That's how we got all of our letters, even in English.
I see. So nun in Aramaic meant snake.
Snake. And even the Hebrew word for snake starts with a nun, nachash. So it makes sense.
I got it. I like that one too.
What is that?
I said I like that one too.
I like that one. It's really cute. It's like a little snake. Yeah. I know that in Arabic, noon means like a big fish, but it's related because actually noon in Aramaic meant like snake or eel.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Their taxonomy back then wasn't great.
Well.
So this is the evolution, but just the last slide I wanted to show you is just this inscription. So this is an original proto kind of like Paleo Hebrew inscription. So this is what it looked like with the original alphabet. Set in stone, literally.
Literally set in stone.
And this was found just outside of Jerusalem. I think this was like around 1800 BC. So you can see like all the way from Sinai, it took off and became very popular. Yeah. So that's it. That's pretty much it.
The translation is about, it looks like it was like on a tomb.
It was on a tomb. Actually, it's pretty cool. It says this is blank. Of course, we don't know the name, right? Because it was, I don't know, like it weathered away or something.
Maybe somebody crossed them off or something.
Yeah, that's possible. It's a very good possibility because it's kind of funny that it's just a name that's missing, right?
Right.
And then there's no silver or gold here. So they're kind of saying like, don't come in here, don't rob my grave because there's nothing in here. So it's just a guy and his maid servant.
Just my bones and my servant.
Yeah.
Yeah, cursed be the man who opens this. Interesting.
Yep.
I don't know. I might be curious to see if that's actually the truth, that there's no silver or gold in there.
Probably means that there is, right?
Right? Wouldn't you think? There's
Right.
nothing to see here. Keep moving along.
It's kind of like reverse psychology, you know, they were trying to.
Right. Well, you would think from what they have in terms of, well, this is a different topic, maybe for another day, but the comparison what they buried with people in Egypt and how they labeled or marked, in that culture that they might have been buried with things like that. So.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yes, not as much as in Egypt because Egypt was much richer, but
Sure.
but yeah, this was kind of like the periphery. It was like the frontier. So think of like Egypt as like New York City,
Uh-huh.
and Jerusalem was kind of like maybe Kentucky in 1800. Okay, like where I live.
Sure. Yeah,
So
different.
there was some gold, but not a lot.
Right. I got it. Well,
Yeah.
this is super interesting. How would you say, when you first start or a very beginner student with Hebrew and learning the Hebrew alphabet? I mean, I remember when I was a little kid, right, we used to practice writing the letters just like we practice writing, in those big blocks of
Right.
practice. And we actually, at the same time that we learned cursive in English, we learn cursive in Hebrew at the same time. But when you're teaching a beginning student, let's say a high school student who now wants to learn, I know with LanguageBird, really we focus a lot on speaking, right, and feeling comfortable being conversational. But when you're trying to teach them how to write or spell in the language, what do you start with first, the sounds or writing the characters?
So thank God Aleph is the first letter because that's the best letter to learn with. Because Aleph is actually a silent consonant, right? It doesn't make a sound on its own. It depends on the vowel sound that is written either above or below and all that. So Aleph is a silent letter. It's lost its voice, right? So Aleph is the one that I usually teach first with all the nikud, all the diacritics. So after they've learned Aleph and all the different sounds, then I always tell them, if you've learned Aleph, that's the hardest one to learn because all the rest are easy. The rest are like English letters, like B and S and K, they're like regular consonants. So once they've got Aleph, down, then it's really easy to learn Bet because if you know that Aleph with Kamatz is A, then Bet with Kamatz will be Ba.
I see.
Yeah.
So just another question about that, because we just got onto this, but when you're teaching, I mean, mostly when I've been in Israel right, when you read from the Torah, when you read in most prayer books or stories and things like that, the language doesn't have the accents, right, or the vowel marks. And so,
Notice, do you see any vowel marks here?
No.
So the vowel marks are a much later development. They only came about around in the Middle Ages, like our Middle Ages. Yeah, that's a very new development.
So when we're teaching now, like when I initially learned Hebrew, right, I learned with vowels.
Sure.
And then you learn with vowels so that you'd know how it sounded and how you were supposed to pronounce it when you were reading. However, in most things, like when you visit Israel, or like I said, when you read from the Torah, like they don't have vowels, so you have to figure it out. So I'm curious as to why people teach with vowels when usually in written Hebrew, they don't include them.
So actually there are two approaches. The more popular one is to start off with vowels. I think it's a good idea because even in Israel, we learn with vowels for the first couple of years of school. You start kind of like omitting them as the student progresses. Sometimes they don't even notice, they're like, oh, how am I ever going to read without vowels? It's impossible. And I say, I know, it's so hard. And then like without telling them, I kind of like start taking them off and they don't even notice. And then they read the word because most of the vocabulary in any language, our active vocabulary is repetitive. We use the same words over and over again. So when you see the same word with vowels 20 times, the 21st time you can read it without vowels.
Get it. Yeah.
And also when we learn verb conjugations, then they always follow the same like vowel pattern. So the more grammar you learn or the more verb conjugations and like word forms, the more you can predict how it's going to sound without vowels. And I find that even beginners, of course, I'm not going to let them read a big text, a long text without vowels, but like you can see that after a few months, you don't have to use vowels with each word anymore. And
Yeah.
they start figuring it out because it becomes predictable.
Okay. It becomes
Hmm.
predictable, and the more you use them, that you know in the context.
Exactly. Yep. Yep.
Very
And nothing is
interesting.
written with vowels in Israel anymore, except for maybe children's books. Like they
Right.
don't, yeah, they're not used at all.
Yeah. That's so interesting. Well, this is so cool. This is a very relevant sort of origin study of where really all written languages come from.
Yeah. It was a revolution. Thank God for the turquoise minds.
Right? Otherwise, they wouldn't have brought it up to Canaan and further, or
I
combined
know. Then
together.
we would still be writing in hieroglyphs and things like that.
That would certainly be a pain, especially if you had a novel or something, right?
Yes. It would have.
Well, Talia, this has been so cool, really interesting discussion, and I love talking to you about these things. And hopefully, your students or future students or those who are interested in Hebrew and the history of written language can get something out of our short session today. And I thank you so much for taking the time to explain and put this together and meet with me.
Yes, of course. It's been fun.
Okay, we'll see you soon.
All right. Bye.